3 years I carried this marriage. Tonight, that ends.
You sure you want to do this here?
In front of all these people? Absolutely. Sign it.
Don't drag this out, man. You know how this ends. I don't think you understand what you're asking.
3 years of watching him go nowhere. No ambition, no results, nothing. I built everything you see tonight without him.
You deserve better. Always did.
Nothing to bring? Then eat off the floor.
She stood at the center of that room like she owned it. Logan's attention, the crowd's silence and divorce papers she believed would finish me for good. What she didn't have was any sense of what I was thinking as I watched that plate shatter at my feet. I didn't reach for the papers. I didn't raise my voice. I looked at the mess she had made and thought about the $280 million Logan still needed. What happens when the man you just threw to the floor is the only one who can save your future? If this kind of story speaks to you, the ones about patience, about what people miss when they stop paying attention, consider subscribing. There's more where this came from. I have replayed that morning more times than I care to admit. Not the dinner, not the plate shattering on the marble floor of Orchid Hall. The morning that came weeks before any of it. The one that started with a security alert on my phone and ended with me sitting at our kitchen table completely still while Heather hummed to herself in the next room and made coffee like the world was exactly what she believed it to be. That gap between what she believed and what was actually true, that was the distance that eventually swallowed everything. My name would not show up if you searched for me in any business registry or board filing. That was not an accident. After my father died, the assets he spent 30 years building were transferred into the Rookwood Family Trust, a structure my Aunt Judith had recommended years earlier, partly for tax reasons, partly because our family had learned the hard way what happened when the wrong people found out how much you were worth. We had been through harassment campaigns, 2 separate extortion attempts, and a lawsuit that dragged on for 4 years before it was quietly settled. The trust was a wall, and the wall worked because it had no face that led back to us. Warren Pritchard served as the public chairman of Sable Rock Infrastructure, the company the trust controlled, and Warren was the name that appeared in press releases, regulatory filings, and industry conferences. My name appeared nowhere. Sable Rock built transportation networks, data centers, and energy systems across multiple states. The portfolio was valued in the billions. None of that was visible in the way I lived, which was by design. I drove a sensible car. I wore unremarkable clothes. I worked under the title of risk management consultant for one of Sable Rock's smaller subsidiaries, which gave me a reason to be at meetings and a reason to review documents without anyone asking why. Judith had insisted on this arrangement until the restructuring was complete, until the formal transfer of voting control from the trust's administrative board to me as the primary beneficiary was finalized. After that, Warren had told me I could make my own decisions about how public to be. I had married Heather 3 years before that restructuring was scheduled to finish. When I told her about my family's situation, I kept it general. A private investment fund. Long-standing business interests. She asked if that meant we were wealthy, and I said it meant we were comfortable, and that I preferred not to make it a topic of conversation. She seemed to find that interesting about me then. She said she appreciated a man who didn't lead with his wallet. We signed a prenuptial agreement that protected assets predating the marriage, and I thought we understood each other well enough to build something real. What I did not anticipate was how quickly the environment she stepped into would reshape what she thought she deserved. Pierce Urban Ventures had a particular atmosphere. Logan Pierce had cultivated it deliberately. The offices were designed to look like they cost more than they did. The company events were held at venues that got photographed, and every conversation seemed to circle back to square footage valuation and who had access to whom. Heather was talented, and Logan recognized that immediately. He started including her in investor meetings, introducing her to people whose names opened doors, and gradually making her feel that the life she had with me was a ceiling she had accidentally accepted instead of a floor she should have already left behind. I noticed the change the way you notice a room slowly getting darker, not in any single moment, but in accumulation. She stopped asking what I thought about things. She started qualifying me to her colleagues before I had even met them, describing me in terms that left just enough room for pity. She mentioned with a particular kind of careful casualness that a few of her coworkers had asked whether I was between jobs. I let those things pass without correcting them, which was a mistake. I understand better now than I did then. At the time, I told myself it was simpler to stay quiet than to explain something I was not yet permitted to explain. That was true. It was also convenient. The security alert came on a Tuesday morning in October. I was at my desk in the subsidiary office when my phone lit up with a notification from Rookwood's asset management team. It was flagged as high priority, which happened rarely enough that I read it immediately. Someone had submitted a loan application to Sable Rock's investment division, referencing my personal financial credentials, my tax filings, my credit profile, my digital signature identifying me as a co-guarantor on a financing package connected to a development project called Red Mesa District. The application had been routed for internal review before anyone on the outside knew it had been flagged. I had not signed any such document. I had not agreed to guarantee anything related to Red Mesa District or any project connected to Pierce Urban Ventures. I went home that afternoon instead of finishing the day at the office. Heather was not there yet. I sat down at the shared computer we kept in the second bedroom and opened the file browser. She had been thorough about most things, but not about this. The folder where I stored backup copies of identity documents, passport, driver's license, tax returns, and a digital signature file I had saved years ago for a contract, showed access timestamps from 3 weeks earlier. The files had been opened, copied, and closed. I checked the cloud sync log and confirmed they had been transferred to an external account. Inside the same folder, I found a document she had named with a date 6 weeks from now. It was a draft divorce petition. She had already filled in the grounds the date of separation she intended to claim, and a note to her attorney about timing the filing to coincide with the close of a pending financing transaction. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I kept reading. The message history I found took longer to get through, partly because of the volume and partly because of what it contained. Heather and Logan had been in regular contact outside of anything work-related for months. The nature of that contact was unambiguous. But it was not the affair that landed heaviest. It was the planning. Logan had promised her a managing partner role at Pierce Urban Ventures once Red Mesa District secured its funding. Heather had told him she would handle Mason, which was the word she used. Handle. She wrote that she would keep things stable at home until the financing came through, and that once it did, she would file and be gone before anything unraveled. She had also written in one message I read twice that he would not cause problems because he had no leverage. She was referring to me as someone who could be managed and discarded because he had no power to fight back. The part. She did not know the part. Logan did not know because the name Rookwood had never led anyone back to Reddick in any search they had run, was that the investment division they were petitioning for $280 million answered ultimately to me. Warren signed the external correspondence. The board received the formal reports. But the decision about whether Sable Rock extended that kind of capital to an outside developer was mine to make. They had walked their application directly to the one person in the world with both the motive and the authority to deny it. I did not confront Heather that night. I thought about it. I had the folder open on the screen, and I knew exactly what I would say. And I sat there long enough that I heard her key in the lock and her heels on the entryway floor. And then I closed the laptop and stood up and went to the kitchen because Rachel Donnelly had been my family's legal counsel for 9 years, and I knew what she would tell me before I even called her. Rachel answered on the second ring. I gave her the outline, the signature, the documents, the messages, the draft petition. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said what I had already worked out for myself. If I confronted Heather, Heather would call Logan within the hour. By morning, the digital records would be altered, the message history would be deleted, and any attorney Logan retained would have a version of events that placed me as an unstable spouse trying to interfere with his wife's professional relationships. Without a clean chain of evidence, I would have a story, and they would have documents. Rachel told me to let her open a quiet investigation into Pierce Urban Ventures and the Red Mesa District financing package. She said she needed time, probably 4 to 6 weeks, to trace the document submissions, recover the communications properly, and build something that would hold up regardless of what Logan's legal team tried to do afterward. She said the most important thing I could do was give no indication that anything had changed. So that was what I did. I finished making dinner. When Heather came in and asked how my day was, I told her it had been quiet. She sat down and talked about a meeting she had been in that afternoon, something about projections for the second phase of the district, and I listened and kept my face arranged in the way she expected. She did not look at me any differently than she had the week before. She had already made her decision about who I was, and that decision was settled in her mind in a way that made real observation unnecessary. I watched her talk and thought about the word she had chosen when she described how she intended to manage me. And I thought about the fact that the next time Logan Pierce sat across a conference table and waited for Sable Rock to approve his future, the person making that decision would be me. Rachel's team worked for 5 weeks. I know because I counted them not out of impatience, but because each week I carried the weight of what I knew, while the world around me continued on its ordinary schedule. Heather had grown more relaxed in that period, not less. Whatever guilt she might have carried in the earlier months had apparently resolved itself into a kind of forward momentum. She talked about her work constantly, about the district, about projections, about Logan's vision for what Denver's West Side could become. She did not talk about me at all, except occasionally to describe something I had failed to do or failed to understand, usually framed as an explanation for why she had to handle everything herself. When Rachel called me into her office on a Thursday morning in November, she had 4 folders laid out on the conference table. She did not lead with conclusions. She walked me through the documents in order, starting with the loan application itself and working backward through the chain of decisions that had produced it. By the time she finished, I had a clear picture of exactly what Logan Pierce had built and what it actually was underneath the surface. Red Mesa District was not a struggling project that needed a capital injection to cross the finish line. It was a project that had been misrepresented from the beginning, land valuations supported by appraisals that did not hold up to independent review, tenant commitments from businesses that had signed letters of intent, but no binding leases, investor projections built on occupancy rates that assumed conditions the Denver market had not seen in over a decade. Logan had taken money from early investors and moved portions of it through consulting firms run by associates firms that existed on paper and billed for services that were either grossly inflated or never performed. He had used the same parcel of land as collateral for loans at 3 separate institutions. He had given every stakeholder a version of the story that made the others' versions impossible to verify. Heather had prepared a significant portion of the presentation materials, the decks, the financial summaries, the one-page briefs that went to prospective lenders. Rachel showed me the email chain where Logan had sent her numbers he described as preliminary, and Heather had incorporated them into formal documents without flagging them as unconfirmed. There was a later exchange recovered from a backup server where Heather had asked Logan directly whether the tenant figures were solid. He had told her not to worry about it, that the funding would close before anyone ran the detailed audits, and she had replied with 2 words understood moving forward. She had known enough to ask the question. She had chosen to accept an answer that told her exactly what she needed to hear, and nothing more. The final piece Rachel showed me was a document that Logan had drafted but never sent a memo addressed to his own legal counsel, laying out a contingency plan in the event the financing fell through or the irregularities were discovered. The plan involved repositioning Heather as the primary author of the financial documents, arguing that she had acted without full authorization and that Logan had relied on her representations in good faith. He had already identified which emails to preserve and which to characterize as her initiative rather than his instruction. He had a version of events ready to deploy that made her the architect of everything and himself the victim of an overeager employee who had exceeded her authority. She had trusted him completely, and he had already written the chapter where he walked away clean, and she absorbed everything. I sat with that for a moment. Then I asked Rachel what she needed from me to proceed. What she told me next was the part I had not anticipated. Sable Rock's investment division had been the last institution Logan approached every other lender with the capacity to extend $280 million against that kind of collateral had already reviewed the application and declined. Some had declined quietly. 2 had flagged concerns internally without taking further action. Sable Rock was not Logan's first choice or his second. It was the end of the line, and he had submitted the application because he had run out of alternatives, and because nothing in Rookwood's public profile had given him any reason to think the outcome would be different from anyone else's rejection. Warren had brought the application to me the same week Rachel finished her review. He laid the folder on my desk and said he recommended an immediate denial followed by a referral to the appropriate regulatory bodies. He was right on all counts, and under any other set of circumstances, I would have signed the denial that afternoon and let the process move forward without another thought. But I kept thinking about the contractors. Logan had sent invitations to the Orchid Hall event 3 weeks earlier, a fundraiser for the Pathways Youth Housing Fund that was, in practical terms, a venue for him to announce the Red Mesa District financing and introduce Heather as his new managing partner. The guest list included regional investors, 2 bank executives, a commercial real estate attorney, and several contractors who had already begun preliminary work on the site. Those contractors were the reason I did not simply sign Warren's denial and move on. The people who had poured foundations and pulled permits and placed orders for materials had no version of events that protected them. If the project collapsed quietly through an administrative denial, Logan's attorneys would spend the next 18 months arguing about liability, and those contractors would be at the back of a very long line. But if the facts were established publicly in a room full of the people Logan had cultivated as witnesses to his credibility, the story became much harder to contain and much harder to reframe. Rachel confirmed that a public disclosure made in front of individuals with direct financial stakes in the project would significantly complicate any attempt by Logan to manage the narrative afterward. I asked Warren to prepare 2 documents. The first was a conditional approval to be held in reserve. The second was a formal denial with a referral to the State Financial Crimes Unit ready to execute. I told him I would decide which one to sign after the dinner. I asked him and Rachel to attend the event separately without any visible connection to each other or to me, and to bring the investigation files in a format that could be presented to the room if necessary. Warren looked at me for a moment and then said very evenly that he would make the arrangements. The night of the dinner, Heather dressed carefully. She was in a particular mood, contained, purposeful, the way a person looks when they believe they are walking towards something they have been waiting a long time to reach. She told me to wear the dark jacket, the one she said made me look like I was trying. I wore it. We drove to the Huxley in my car, and she spent most of the ride on her phone, and when we arrived, she walked ahead of me through the lobby without waiting. Inside Orchid Hall, she had arranged the seating herself. I found my name card at the far end of this table near the service entrance between 2 guests I had never met. Heather was at the center of the table beside Logan in the kind of positioning that announces its own meaning before anyone says a word. I sat down and ordered water and watched the room fill. The evening moved the way these events always do. Cocktail conversation that orbits around the same 3 topics. A past appetizer that no one really eats. Introductions that are really assessments. Logan worked the room with the ease of someone who had done it for years. He asked questions that made people feel interesting. He laughed at the right moments. He touched shoulders and remembered names and moved through the crowd like a man who had no doubt about his place in it. At some point in the first hour, a man I did not know leaned over and asked me what I did. Before I could answer, Heather appeared at his elbow with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, and she said I was still figuring that out. She said it lightly as a joke in the tone that makes the subject of a joke feel they have no standing to object. The man nodded politely and turned to speak with someone else, and Heather moved back toward Logan without looking at me again. That set the rhythm for the rest of the evening. She told a woman near her that she covered the household expenses because my income was unpredictable. She told another guest that she had learned to stop waiting for me to take initiative. She said these things with a kind of fond exasperation, the performance of a patient person who had accepted a difficult situation with grace. Logan confirmed each detail with a nod or a brief word of sympathy, and the picture they built together. One casual remark at a time was of a man who sat at the far end of the table for the same reason. Furniture gets pushed to the edges of a room because it serves no purpose where it might be noticed. Warren arrived near the end of the main course. Logan crossed the room to greet him with the enthusiasm of a man who had been waiting for this specific guest all evening. He believed Warren was there to deliver confirmation that the Sable Rock Investment Division had completed its review and the $280 million was on its way. Warren shook his hand, said something brief, and made his way to his assigned seat without any further acknowledgement of Logan's expectation. He sat down across the room from me and kept his attention on his menu. Heather watched that exchange and interpreted it the way she had been interpreting everything that evening as confirmation that things were proceeding according to plan. After the main plates were cleared, Logan stood up and addressed the room. He thanked the guests for their support of the Pathways Fund. He spoke about Red Mesa District in terms that made it sound both visionary and inevitable. And then he announced that Heather Reddick would be joining Pierce Urban Ventures as managing partner effective upon the close of the project's financing in recognition of the extraordinary work she had done to bring the development to this stage. There was applause. Heather stood and accepted it with a smile that looked completely natural because she had been practicing it in one form or another for months. Then she walked to my end of the table. She had the divorce petition in her hand, the same one I had found drafted on our shared computer 6 weeks earlier now, printed and paper-clipped and carried like a prop in a scene she had written and rehearsed. She set it in front of me and told the room that she had given 3 years to a man who had given nothing in return, and that tonight she was correcting that mistake. She said it clearly and without evident emotion, the way you announce a decision that has already been made and only needs to be formalized. I looked at the document. Then I looked at her. "Are you sure this is how you want to do this?" I asked. Her expression shifted not dramatically, just a tightening around the eyes that told me my calm had landed somewhere she hadn't prepared for. She reached out and swept my dinner plate off the table. The sound it made hitting the marble floor was louder than she probably intended. "You never brought anything to this table," she said, "so eat off the floor." Logan signaled to someone near the door. 2 members of the venue's security staff began moving toward me from across the room. Rachel set a folder on the table to her left. Warren stood up. He looked across the room at me with the particular expression of a man who has been waiting a long time to say something, and he said it in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of Orchid Hall. "Chairman Reddick, how would you like us to proceed with the financing?" The room did not erupt. It went quiet in a way that felt heavier than noise, the particular silence of people who have just realized that what they thought they were watching was not the performance they had been invited to see. I heard a chair scrape somewhere behind me. Warren stood at his full height across the room, his expression composed, his question still hanging in the air between us. Heather turned to look at him. Then she turned to look at me. Her mouth was open slightly, not in speech, but in the intermediate space before speech, when the mind is still trying to assemble words that might make sense of something that has stopped making sense. Logan moved first. He crossed toward Warren with the momentum of a man who has decided that a misunderstanding is the most likely explanation and that a misunderstanding can be managed. He said something about timing, about a conversation they might have outside, about how the evening could still proceed in a productive direction. Warren listened with the patient attention of someone who has already decided he will not be redirected, and when Logan finished, Warren said only that Chairman Reddick had asked a question and he was waiting for an answer. Logan turned to me. I watched him reassemble his expression in real time, the charm coming back online, the social fluency returning like a practiced reflex. He said that whatever complications had arisen, he was confident they could be resolved between reasonable people and that the Red Mesa district represented a genuine opportunity for Denver that none of them would want to see lost over procedural details. I told him to sit down. He sat down. Warren stepped forward and gave the room a brief explanation. The restructuring of the Rookwood Family Trust had been finalized that evening. As the trust's primary beneficiary and the holder of its controlling voting interest, I had assumed the formal role of chairman of Sable Rock Infrastructure effective as of that night. The financing application that Pierce Urban Ventures had submitted to Sable Rock's investment division, the $280 million package that Logan had spent the better part of a year pursuing, was under my authority to approve or deny. Heather said it was a mistake. She said there had to be a misunderstanding that Mason was a risk consultant for a small subsidiary, that she had seen his tax filings and they did not reflect anything like what Warren was describing. Her voice had the brittle quality of someone trying to argue their way out of a fact. Logan said nothing. He had gone very still, which told me he was doing the math faster than Heather was, and arriving at conclusions she had not reached yet. Rachel opened the folder she had placed on the table and began distributing documents to the seats around her. She did not make a speech. She simply placed specific pages in front of specific people and let them read. The bank executive 2 seats to her left received the series of loan applications showing the same parcel used as collateral across 3 separate institutions. The commercial real estate attorney at the far end of the table received the appraisal reports alongside the independent valuations Rachel's team had commissioned with the discrepancies highlighted. The contractors who had done preliminary work on the site received a summary of the internal memo. Logan had never sent the one that named Heather as the primary author of the financial documents and outlined a strategy for positioning her as the responsible party if the deal collapsed. That last document produced the only audible reaction in the room. One of the contractors read it, looked up at Logan and set it back down on the table very deliberately, like a man who has just understood how close he came to something he did not see approaching. Logan stood up again and said that document was a draft taken out of context, that Rachel was acting as an advocate for a party with an obvious interest in discrediting the project. His voice had recovered its steadiness, but the steadiness was mechanical now, the performance of confidence rather than the thing itself. Heather did not stand up with him. She was reading the page in front of her, the recovered message exchange, where she had confirmed she understood that the tenant figures were unverified and had chosen to move forward anyway, and whatever she was feeling as she read it, she was feeling it alone. I did not feel the satisfaction I had imagined feeling in the weeks I had spent waiting. What I felt was something more deliberate, a clear sense of what needed to happen next and in what order. I told Warren to deny the financing application and to initiate the referral to the State Financial Crimes Unit. I told Rachel to ensure that copies of the complete investigation file were held in escrow by her firm so that no subsequent claim of lost or altered documentation could affect the evidentiary record. Then I said that before anyone left the room, I wanted Sable Rock's operations team to identify every contractor and subcontractor who had performed verified work on the Red Mesa site under the assumption that the financing was legitimate. I said the company would establish a temporary fund to cover outstanding invoices for completed work, not as a concession to Logan's project, but because the people who had poured foundations and pulled permits had done their jobs in good faith, and their exposure was not a consequence of anything they had done wrong. Warren confirmed that he would have the logistics arranged by morning. Logan made one more attempt. He said that what I was describing would destroy a project that employed hundreds of people, that a man in my position had a responsibility to the broader economic picture. I told him the fund to cover the contractor's outstanding invoices would be Sable Rock's contribution to the broader economic picture. I told him the rest was his to manage with whatever attorneys he retained in the morning. Then I picked up the divorce petition from the table, signed the acknowledgement of receipt on the last page, and placed it back in front of Heather. She was looking at me with an expression I had not seen on her before, not the frustration I had come to expect, not the casual dismissal she had refined over the past year, but something that looked closer to recognition. Like she was meeting someone she should have been introduced to a long time ago. I told her that Rachel would be in contact with her attorney about the prenuptial agreement and the terms of the division. I said I was not interested in taking anything she had earned through her own work, but that I expected the return of the documents she had taken from my files, the repayment of the funds she had moved from our joint accounts without authorization, and her written agreement not to make public statements attributing any part of the Red Mesa situation to me. Before I walked out of Orchid Hall, I stopped at the place where my dinner plate had shattered on the marble floor. A staff member had already swept most of it away, but there was still a mark where the ceramic had struck a faint impact in the surface that would probably buff out by morning. I looked at it and said what I had been carrying since the moment it happened, not loudly, not for effect, just clearly enough for the people near me to hear. A person's value does not depend on where they sit at the table. But the way we treat someone we believe has nothing that tells you exactly who we are. Then I left. The weeks that followed were procedural in the way that endings usually are once the decisions have actually been made. Pierce Urban Ventures could not continue Red Mesa District without the Sable Rock financing, and when word spread through the investment community that the project's application had been denied and referred for investigation, The two institutions that had previously declined quietly began cooperating with the review process rather than waiting to be subpoenaed. Logan's board moved to remove him from his executive role within 10 days of the dinner. 3 investor groups filed suit within the month, citing the fraudulent representations in the project documentation. Logan's first move, once the legal machinery engaged, was to produce the emails and presentation materials that carried Heather's name. His attorneys argued exactly what his never-sent memo had outlined, that she had acted beyond her authority, that he had relied on her representations in good faith, that the errors in the financial documents were hers in origin. Rachel's files made that argument considerably harder to sustain. The communications showing Logan directing Heather toward the falsified figures, the evidence that he had identified her as a contingency scapegoat before the deal had even collapsed, those materials went into the record, and the record was not something either of them could rewrite. Heather lost her position, and because the company's troubles became public in a way that attached her name to the documentation questions, her standing in Denver's development community contracted sharply. The people who had laughed along with her jokes about my lack of ambition did not return her calls at the same rate they once had. That was not something I engineered. It was simply what happens when the story changes and people adjust their positions accordingly. The divorce settled along the lines of the prenuptial agreement, which had been drafted carefully enough that its terms held without significant dispute. She had no claim on Sable Rock or on the Rookwood Trust assets, which predated the marriage by years and had been legally insulated from any marital property consideration. I did not seek to recover her personal savings or her professional earnings. I asked for what I had said I would ask for in that room: the documents, the repayment, the agreement about public statements, and I received them. She sent messages in the early weeks, several of them. She said she still loved me, that Logan had manipulated her ambition, and she had not recognized it until it was too late. I read the first 2. After that, I let them collect without opening them, not out of cruelty, but because there was nothing she could say that would change the shape of what had happened. I had already decided that what I owed her was a fair settlement and nothing beyond it. I told Judith all of this over the course of several conversations. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, and when I finished, she said that the secrecy had served its purpose, but that it had also cost me the ability to be known by my own wife. I told her she was right. I said that my silence had not caused Heather's choices, but that it had made a certain kind of distance easier to inhabit than it should have been, and that whatever came next, I intended to be more careful about confusing protection with concealment. 14 months after the dinner at Orchid Hall, I assumed the chairmanship of Sable Rock Infrastructure in full. Sable Rock acquired the viable portion of the Red Mesa site through a competitive bidding process, a transparent one administered by an independent firm with no connection to the previous ownership. The mixed-use luxury development that Logan had envisioned was not what the land became. Working with a Denver-based planning firm and input from the surrounding neighborhoods, we redesigned the project as workforce housing for teachers, healthcare workers, and families in the middle-income range that the city had been losing for years. A portion of the project's returns was directed to the Pathways Youth Housing Fund, the same charity whose name Logan had put on the invitation to Orchid Hall, the one that had lent the evening its cover of civic purpose. The day the first community building opened, I did not sit at the table reserved for donors. I found a seat with the volunteers and the families who were moving in that weekend, most of them carrying boxes and children, and the particular exhaustion of people who have been waiting a long time for something to come through. A boy, maybe 8 years old, maybe 9, reached across the table for something and knocked his plate to the floor. The sound it made was not unlike the sound a dinner plate makes on marble. He froze, looking at the adults around him with the expression of a child who has learned that accidents sometimes have costs that exceed the accident itself. I bent down and helped him pick up the pieces. I put a new plate in front of him and told him not to worry about it. He looked up at me and asked if I was sure. I told him that food falls, that happens, but people should never be pushed down there with it. My phone lit up on the table. A message from Heather asking whether there was any possibility after everything of beginning again. I looked at it for a moment, then turned it face down on the table. I pulled an empty chair closer to the family beside me and stayed for the rest of the meal. There are things you can rebuild and things you cannot. And the difference is not always about damage. Sometimes it is about what was actually there before the damage and whether the foundation was ever what you believed it to be. I had spent 3 years in a marriage where my wife had never really seen me, and I had made it easier for her not to by staying invisible. I was not invisible anymore. But I was also not the same person who had chosen silence over clarity at that kitchen table, and going back required becoming that person again. And that was the one thing I had no interest in doing. What I took from all of it was not a lesson about money or power or what happens when the wrong people underestimate you. It was something simpler than that, and something I think most of us already know, but occasionally need to be reminded of in the most direct way possible. The way you treat someone when you believe they have nothing, when you think they have no status, no leverage, no ability to affect your life, that is the truest version of who you are. Not the version you perform at dinner tables that matter, not the one you show to people whose approval you want. The unguarded one. The one that comes out when you believe no one important is watching. Heather was wrong about what I was worth. But more than that, she was wrong about what it meant to be worth something in the first place. If this story made you think about patience, about what we miss when we decide too quickly who someone is, I'd be glad to have you along for the next one. Subscribing takes 2 seconds, and there are more stories like this one waiting for you.